A car bomb hurls investigators down a dark and twisted path. At the end is one woman with many deadly secrets. A bustling emergency room is brought to its knees with the arrival of a dying woman. Scientists try to determine what might have turned her blood to toxic gas. A Florida family is mysteriously sickened. The mother suffers a lingering death. Before police can catch the killer, they must first find the source of the poison. The most subtle of killers is absolutely silent, working from the inside out to turn its victim's body against itself. When chemistry goes wrong, scientists struggle to determine what constitutes a lethal dosage. June 28, 1983, began as a night of celebration. Judy Bueno Año met her boyfriend, John Gentry, and the women who worked at her beauty salon at a Pensacola, Florida restaurant. They gathered to present one of the employees with a pendant in honor of her birthday. As the dinner was finished and the party wore down, Judy suggested that John go to the liquor store for some champagne so they could continue celebrating elsewhere. As night fell, the streets grew quiet. But the silence would be shattered in an instant. Police and rescue raced to the scene. Gentry was rushed to the hospital, shrapnel embedded in his back. At first, investigators weren't sure if the explosion was due to mechanical failure or an attempt on Gentry's life. But even a cursory look at the crime scene revealed the blast to be no accident. It came from the trunk, an unlikely place for an explosion of that magnitude. Because bombings are a federal offense, Pensacola police notified the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. By the extent of the blast, ATF agents estimated 2 sticks of dynamite were used, rigged to the taillights by yellow and orange wire. Gentry was lucky to have escaped with his life. As the ATF investigated the scene and the crime photos, Pensacola police sought to find out who would benefit from Gentry's death. That task fell to Detective Ted Chamberlain.
What we usually do is we look into insurance policies of the victim, and that's what we did with Gentry. And we looked into and we found he did have a large insurance policy on him.
The beneficiary was Judy Bueno Año, Gentry's girlfriend. But that wasn't surprising. The two were starting a business together. By itself, the information meant nothing. Chamberlain needed more to go on. The ATF found it. They traced the dynamite to a man in Alabama, a very close friend of Judy Bueno Año. By now, Gentry was out of intensive care. Detectives took the opportunity to talk to him about what happened, to let him know that Judy Bueno Año was the main suspect. Gentry found it difficult to believe, but then he began thinking about it.
He said, you know, when I'm staying over there at Judy's house, she was giving me these pills, vitamins to make me feel better. And he said, I kept getting sick. He said, so I quit taking them. And then I felt better. He said, and I took them again and got sick again.
Gentry had been so ill, he'd spent time in the hospital. There, he recovered completely, though his doctor wasn't sure what was wrong with him. Once Gentry returned home, he relapsed.
pills for you right here.
Finally, he stopped taking the vitamin pills and his health returned. He felt his days of illness were behind him. And then his car blew up. Sensing a connection, the detective asked Gentry if he'd saved any of the capsules.
Do you have a business partner?
As a matter of fact, he had. They were supposedly a popular vitamin C supplement.
What were you doing? Who were you with?
Chamberlain sent them to the lab for analysis.
My wife's
Finding out what something isn't is easier than finding out what it is. The process of elimination began with a comparison of the capsules with vitamin C. It proved there was not a speck of the vitamin in the capsules. That discovery alone ramped up the suspicion that the pills were poisoned. But what was in them? The substance in the capsules was dissolved and tested. Some tests analyzed its chemical makeup, others measured the wavelengths of light it absorbed. By comparing these results with a database of chemicals, the compound was identified. The capsules were found to contain a substance called paraformaldehyde. It has no known medical use. In fact, it's considered a Class 3 poison, which means it's moderately toxic. John Trestrail of the Bludgeoned Poison Control Center is a poisoning expert. According to him, if murder was the motive, paraformaldehyde wasn't the best choice.
When it breaks down to formaldehyde, which we know is used to preserve bodies, is very irritating. It wouldn't be a very good poison to pick for homicidal reasons. It'd be more irritating, irritating to the eyes, irritating to the respiratory tract. And I suppose in chronic exposures, we know formaldehyde can cause cancer.
Gentry's story, bolstered by the tampered pills and the explosion, gave Chamberlain ample grounds to obtain search warrants for Bueno Año's home and beauty salon. At her house, they found more vitamin capsules.
coming right up.
Okay.
I'll check the closet.
Yeah, I had something like that when I was a kid.
Basket. Oh, I got something.
In her son's closet, they
Orange
found
wire.
wire that resembled the wire used to blow up the car.
Look at this. Got a wire here. My gloves.
So we sent that off to the lab, and they sent us back pictures of the wire and the color coding and striations of the wire. One taken from the piece of the bomb that was gone, and the one from the boy's room, and you put them together, it was just like matching up ballistics on bullets. I mean, they looked exactly alike, and that was real good evidence.
Hi, I'm Detective Robert Beasley. This is an official investigation.
While one group of officers searched the house, another group was at work collecting chemicals from Bueno Año's salon.
I'm not sure either, but let's bag
For Judy Bueno Año, paraformaldehyde would be a poison of opportunity.
powders and stuff. Be careful with it. Don't.
The chemical is used in beauty salons as a disinfectant. With evidence of the bomb and the poison, police had ample grounds to arrest her on suspicion.
Yep.
The bombing made her a suspect in a federal crime. The ATF's jurisdiction stretched beyond Florida to all 50 states. Having failed at both poisoning and blowing up her lover, Bueno Año seemed like a two-time loser. But as investigators checked her background, they began to suspect that she may have just been in a slump. As news of Judy Bueno Año's arrest spread, Detective Chamberlain received a call from the mother of one of her ex-boyfriends in Alabama, a man named Bobby Joe Morris, a man who had died mysteriously.
Her son and Judy lived together, and she had a very strong suspicion that he didn't die of natural causes, that she had poisoned or killed her son.
Bueno Año had pressured Bobby Joe's mother to cremate the body, but she refused. Chamberlain promised he'd look into the matter.
Everybody that we talked to, they all seemed to be a little bit scared of Judy, a little bit afraid of her, that she would always make up these incredible stories is what we were hearing from her. And we even talked to one witness that the witness said that Judy had told this girl, said, look, if you don't like your husband, poison him.
With stories of Bobby Joe Morris and others coming to light, police began to suspect that John Gentry wasn't Bueno Año's first victim. They found that her life, at least on the surface, appeared touched by tragedy. But a closer inspection suggested something more diabolical. Judy lost her husband, James Goodyear, in 1971. 3 months after he returned from Vietnam, he lapsed into delirium and died.
What a great day for a stakeout.
After his death, Judy changed her name from Judy Goodyear to Judy Bueno Año, the Spanish translation of her husband's surname. The deeper Chamberlain dug, the darker Judy's past became. Bodies were beginning to tumble out of her closet.
You'd open up one door and go in, and it would lead to about 5 or 6 more doors. That was the problem with her. You know, it just didn't look like it was ever going to stop. You know, we kept finding bodies everywhere.
One of those bodies was her own son, Michael Goodyear. He joined the Army in 1979. Shortly after visiting his mother while on leave, he became ill. Tests showed exposure to arsenic. Because his job involved working with the substance, it was assumed that he'd inadvertently ingested some. He soon began to lose the use of his arms and legs, and he was discharged. His first day home, Judy and her youngest son took Michael on a canoe trip near their home. Despite the fact that Michael wore heavy braces, he had no life jacket. In the middle of the lake, the boat capsized and Michael drowned. Back then, it seemed like a tragic, if stupid, accident. But now, Chamberlain wasn't so certain. Too many men in Judy Bueno Año's life had come to an untimely end. A sinister pattern was taking shape. While Judy awaited her day in court for the attempted murder of John Gentry, Chamberlain gathered evidence of homicide she may have gotten away with, at least so far. He learned that Judy's husband, James Goodyear, showed symptoms consistent with any number of illnesses, among them arsenic poisoning. If he was poisoned, the evidence was buried with him. 12 years after his death, his body was ordered exhumed to look for proof.
And when you exhume a body looking for one of the heavy metals like lead, thallium, arsenic, antimony, these are all elements. Elements have been around since the solar system was created. They're just as detectable today as they were 250 million years ago and 250 million years down the road from now. So when you talk about digging up a body looking for arsenic, if it was in that body when it went in the ground, it's going to be in that body until it disintegrates.
Goodyear had been autopsied at the time of his death, but the medical examiner wasn't looking for poison, so he didn't find any. Almost anything can be poisonous if enough is swallowed, so no single test can be used to detect all poisons. The analyst must be guided by his knowledge of the symptoms so he can narrow the field and test for specific poisons. Arsenic tends to concentrate in the heart, liver, lungs, and kidneys. Samples of each were tested for the toxin. Arsenic can take down a person in an hour or a year, depending on how much he ingests. A single large dose kills quicker than small doses over a longer time. A faster death means the poison would have less time to damage organs. Goodyear's lingering death suggested cumulative long-term poisoning. The ravaged condition of his organs bore that out. The diagnosis was crucial and incriminating because it made accidental poisoning less likely. Since James and Judy Goodyear lived in the same house, it seemed reasonable that they'd both be exposed to arsenic if the hazard were present. But Judy never showed any symptoms. Next, the medical examiner set out to determine how much arsenic was present in Goodyear's system. The victim's hair and nails provided a handy yardstick. A complete fingernail was removed from the nail bed and dissolved in acid. The resulting solution was put in an instrument called an atomic absorption spectrometer that determines the concentration of arsenic in the sample. The amount of arsenic a person swallows is proportional to the amount in the victim's hair and nails. The medical examiner could tell that the levels were too high to have come from the environment. And since hair grows at a set rate, he could use it to see how long Goodyear had been given the poison. He determined that the contaminated portion of the hair was consistent with 3 months' growth. James Goodyear had been home from the Navy 3 months before he died. The evidence suggested that Judy had wasted no time doing away with her husband. Shortly after James Goodyear's autopsy, Judy's boyfriend and second suspected victim, Bobby Joe Morris, was exhumed. His hair and nails contained enough arsenic to kill 11 men. It appeared that over a 12-year period, Judy Bueno Año managed to fatally poison 2 men and poison and drown a third. Other men in her life had also met mysterious ends, but she was never prosecuted for their deaths. The motive in every case was insurance money. Ironically, it was the one who got away, John Gentry, that ultimately exposed her deadly game. Her botched attempt to poison him forced her to resort to using a bomb. On the surface, the choice may seem bizarre, but to poison expert John Trestrail, the difference between bombs and poisons is only a matter of degree.
I personally believe there's a great similarity between the psychological profile of a bomber and a poisoner. Because what is a poison other than a chemical bomb? It doesn't make any noise. The effect is the same. You blow up the victim.
Poisoning is more subtle and may at first go undetected. But there's no statute of limitations on murder, and poison leaves its traces for a very long time. One clue is all it takes to expose the truth.
And of course, every poisoner looks for the perfect poison that's undetectable. And my answer is, what would you call it? If it's got a name, don't you have to see something to name it? And if you see it, is it not detectable? So there is no perfect, non-detectable poison.
Judy Bueno Año received 12 years for bombing Gentry's car, life in prison for the drowning death of her son, and is on death row for poisoning her husband. For the death of Bobby Joe Morris, there was simply no punishment left to give her. She is one of only 48 women ever sentenced to death in the United States. It took years for Bueno Año's methodical poisonings to catch up with her, but once her villainy was revealed, the evidence was irrefutable. Across the country, scientists faced a more perplexing dilemma. How could the body of a dying woman poison the staff of an emergency room? Just after 8 p.m. on February 9, 1994, paramedics whisked 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez into the emergency room at California's Riverside Hospital. Her boyfriend called because she collapsed and had trouble breathing. The paramedics related to the ER staff that the patient had cervical cancer, but she hadn't yet begun chemotherapy. In fact, there was nothing in her record to prepare the ER for what was to come. When Ramirez arrived at the emergency room, she already had an oxygen mask on her face. Then her heart rhythm began to fluctuate, and the staff tried to shock it back to normal. It wasn't working. A nurse drew blood to run some tests. And that's when the well-choreographed chaos of the emergency room began to fall to pieces. Ramirez's body began to take on an oily sheen. The nurse drawing the blood complained of a strange odor. She handed the hypodermic to a physician. Then she passed out. The odor, something like garlic or ammonia, increased. Beige crystals were noticed in the blood sample. Suddenly, another nurse fell. In short order, another nurse became dizzy and went to the nurses' station to rest. There, she lost consciousness. Her arms and legs began to shake uncontrollably. Occasionally, she'd stop breathing. Then one of the doctors succumbed. Ramirez was still not stabilized. An emergency was declared as attendants rushed in to clear the collapsing staff and attend to Ramirez. As the emergency room was evacuated, gurneys were wheeled into the parking lot. Unable to cope with the bizarre onslaught, Riverside sent its staff and patients to other hospitals. The caregivers suddenly became the patients. Bedlam ruled, and at its center lay a helpless, dying woman. Within 15 minutes of contact with Gloria Ramirez, 27 of the 37 staff members at Riverside Hospital suffered strange symptoms. Respiratory therapist Maureen Welch was one of them.
After I awoke, outside was very sick. Uncontrollable tremors, nausea, retching, difficulty breathing. My vision felt kind of limited at that time. I could only see things close to me.
There was simply no explaining what could have caused the symptoms. Many of those affected recovered quickly. Others spent weeks in the hospital. Within 35 minutes of Ramirez's arrival at the hospital, she was pronounced dead. The crisis had passed, but the mystery deepened.
35.
Her body was sealed in 2 plastic bags and an airtight casket before being moved to the hospital morgue. To find the cause of the catastrophe, the Riverside Hazardous Materials, or HAZMAT team, arrived suited for battle. Ductwork, sewage lines, plumbing, and waste disposal were thoroughly checked. The air in the emergency room was electronically sniffed for toxic gases, solvents, or chemicals. Nothing was overlooked, and nothing could explain what happened. Once the emergency room was given a clean bill of health, suspicions turned to the patient. An autopsy revealed nothing extraordinary. Gloria Ramirez died of kidney failure as a result of her cancer. Dissatisfied with the findings and desperate for an explanation, hospital officials sent blood and tissue samples from Ramirez to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, 60 miles east of San Francisco. Solvents were added to Ramirez's blood sample. Organic chemicals in the blood were dissolved, leaving water and blood cells behind. The result is a highly concentrated extract of the chemicals in the blood. Brian Andresen is the director of the center.
Here in our laboratory are very precise analytical tools that allow us to look at every chemical that we extracted from the blood sample and actually determine the chemical structure and even get concentrations, all down at ultra low concentrations.
Identifying the chemicals took a two-pronged approach. First, the extract of Ramirez's blood was heated in a gas chromatograph until it vaporized. Because every chemical vaporizes at a different rate, the components separated. The spectrometer then identified each chemical by reading the patterns of light they emitted. The results were then plotted on a computer in the form of peaks and valleys. What would Ramirez's blood reveal?
Every peak here is a different, unique chemical that was in the blood of Mrs. Ramirez. And things stand out. It's very obvious. This is all Tylenol or acetaminophen is right here. Cholesterol is here, other drugs, and a very unusual chemical that we initially discovered, which was right here. We don't know what it is at this moment, but luckily we have libraries that when you actually search a library, in the computer it will print out what this chemical is.
It turned out to be a high concentration of a chemical called dimethylsulfone, or DMSO2. It comes from the breakdown of another chemical, DMSO, or dimethyl sulfoxide. Though it's manufactured as an industrial lubricant, DMSO is used by thousands of athletes and arthritis sufferers to relieve pain. It's conceivable that Ramirez was using it for this purpose. But its waste product, DMSO2, is not toxic, even in the high concentrations found in her tissues. Its presence did nothing to explain why the emergency room was brought to its knees. From his findings, Andresen had to conclude he'd found nothing to account for the harrowing events on the night Ramirez died. Without any physical explanation for what was now being called the Ramirez incident, the California Department of Health Services wrote it off to mass hysteria due to stress. The healthcare workers were not buying it.
My response to the claim of mass hysteria was not something that I can entertain personally, because the people involved in emergency care, and in particular this emergency room, were all like a well-oiled machine. They'd all had tons of experience, 15 or years better, veterans of all types of occurrences, and this was just something else that they had to take care of. And you can't argue with that. I mean, these people are not generally hysterical.
Unwilling to accept the ruling of the health department, Welch did some homework of her own. She knew that many of her colleagues, and she herself, had suffered long-term health problems, not the sort of symptoms induced by mass hysteria. She gathered up lab reports, medical records, and contacted Brian Andresen. Andresen and his colleague, Deputy Director Patrick Grant, looked over the data Welch sent them. They focused on the one compound that didn't seem to fit.
Basically, I came back into my office and started looking up compounds in the Chemist's Bible, the Merck Index. Looked up dimethyl sulfoxide and dimethyl sulfone, and fortunately, they're right there together in language even a nuclear chemist can understand. And at that point, I realized that oxidation was the connector between the two.
Can you talk to me?
If Ramirez was taking DMSO on her own to relieve her pain, it seemed plausible the extra oxygen she was given on the way to the hospital could have sped the chemical's transformation to its waste product, DMSO2. DMSO is oily and has a garlicky smell. That could explain the sheen on Ramirez's skin and the odor in the emergency room. But it didn't explain why so many people were sickened. Pat Grant began to formulate a theory. On the same page in the drug manual as DMSO and DMSO2 was an entry for DMSO4. The only difference between the two compounds was more oxygen, but it was a crucial difference. DMSO2 is a harmless vapor. DMSO4 is a deadly nerve gas.
And if you read the toxicities and the various symptoms that people that are exposed to dimethyl sulfate experience, it was quite similar to the Riverside incident.
Grant's theory sounded good on paper, but no one had ever turned harmless DMSO2 into deadly DMSO4 in the lab by simply adding more oxygen. If Grant was asserting that a dying woman could somehow change into a canister of nerve gas, he was going to have to prove it. The scientists at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory had a daunting task ahead of them. To see if DMSO2 could turn into its deadly cousin, DMSO4, in the emergency room, they had to replicate the conditions during the last few minutes of Gloria Ramirez's life. The work was assigned to analytical chemist Rich Whipple. The first obstacle was the nature of the two substances. While harmless DMSO2 dissolves in blood, deadly DMSO4 doesn't. So how could the compound be in Ramirez's veins? The answer is, it couldn't.
Our belief is that she had DMSO2 in the blood, and then when it was withdrawn from her system, it was then converted to DMSO4.
The chemical event, if it happened at all, happened in the syringe. Using a substitute for human blood, Whipple performed an experiment to show how a change in temperature could change the form of the chemical. At body temperature, DMSO2 stays dissolved in the solution. But cooled to room temperature, it forms crystals. Crystals like the ones witnessed by some of the emergency room staff. In her body, Ramirez's blood was 98.6 degrees, but the portion drawn into the syringe was immediately cooled to around 64 degrees, the temperature of the emergency room. The drastic temperature change may have caused the DMSO2 crystals to separate out. Everything about the theory seemed to be holding together except one crucial point. Whipple didn't manage to produce any detectable DMSO4. But lab tests can never perfectly replicate a real-life situation. In the emergency room, only the slightest amount of DMSO4 would have been needed to sicken all those staffers. 1/10 of a gram of the substance can be lethal. In smaller doses, DMSO4 can cause long-term nerve damage and other lingering health problems. A year or more after the Ramirez incident, some of the staffers in the emergency room still had symptoms. Grant believes this is further evidence in favor of a chemical explanation, not mass hysteria or some other psychological cause.
In comparison to the other theories that were out there before we proposed our chemical theory, I would believe it over mass hysteria of an experienced emergency room staff.
Though Grant's findings are generally accepted, many scientists await further proof before they're convinced. Until the mechanism for the deadly transformation is fully understood, there remains a slim chance that the Ramirez incident could happen again. The events in Riverside's emergency room highlight how toxic hazards can come from the least likely sources. That's a fact poisoners use to their advantage. Since anything can be a poison, the killer can hide his weapon in plain sight. At 7 a.m., October 23, 1988, Peggy Carr arrived at a restaurant in Alturas, Florida, where she worked as a waitress. As she waited for her shift to start, She began to feel ill.
I don't know. I just thought
Soon, her legs started to burn, and pain racked her chest. She thought she was having a heart attack. One of the regulars, a former Army medic, checked her pulse and reassured her that whatever was ailing her, it wasn't her heart.
I don't know.
But the pain continued to grow. Peggy was sent home to rest. The pain was unrelenting, and Peggy's family sent her to the hospital.
Real tight.
She was admitted and placed under observation. 16 hours after her first symptoms, Peggy Carr was practically incapacitated, and her physician was stumped. 3 days and a battery of tests later, doctors were no closer to making a diagnosis. Then, just as mysteriously as they had begun, Peggy's symptoms began to fade. She was sent home.
And my chest is real tight.
But within a week, the crushing pain gripped her again. She was rushed back to the hospital. Besides the intense pain in her limbs and joints, her hair began to fall out, and she was becoming unable to move. Tests still showed nothing wrong with her. Doctors thought some virus had nestled in her nervous system. She told her neurologist that she felt like she was walking on hot coals. The description brought to mind something he'd only read about. He decided to try one more test for thallium poisoning. Thallium is a natural element found in trace amounts in soil and water. Its purified form is strictly regulated. Up until 1972, when it was banned in the United States, it was used in rat and ant poisons. Tests showed that Peggy Carr's system had 20,000 times the amount of thallium one might expect to find. The poison was eating away her nervous system. There was no cure. At first, Peggy's poisoning was considered accidental.
The girls from church.
Tests on her family revealed that everyone in the Carr household had traces of it.
Oh, we can't decide.
The Polk County Sheriff's Department and the Health Department combed the Carr's house to find the source of the contaminant. Detective Ernie Mincy led the investigation.
Our sole purpose was to identify that poison and have it removed from the environment to prevent further injury to any of the persons.
Over the next month, investigators collected food, water, and soil samples in the Carr's home and neighborhood. Everything was sent to the lab to be tested. After an impatient wait, every test came back negative. Investigators were desperate to find the source of the poison. Meanwhile, Peggy could no longer breathe on her own and lapsed into a coma. The search for the poison continued.
Can I have some more bags,
How many
please?
others would be sickened before it was found? Among the items collected from the Carr's house were returnable bottles of Coca-Cola. One of them was broken. All had residue on the bottom. Like everything else, they were sent off for analysis. The bottles joined the ranks of dozens of items collected from the Carr's house. Each had been subjected to the same test. Each had been eliminated. Investigators hoped to have better luck with the bottles. To test for thallium, the residue was dissolved in nitric acid. A sample was placed in a graphite tube and vaporized. Then, a lamp with a thallium filament was shined into the tube. The test relies on the principle that every compound emits a specific wavelength of light. An instrument called a spectrophotometer measured the amount of light absorbed by the sample. It showed that the bottles contained more than 11 times the level of the toxin one might expect to find. Finally, the source of the poison had been found. But how did thallium get into the soft drink? Were others out there waiting to be consumed? Mincy feared a manufacturing catastrophe or malicious tampering. With the assistance of the FBI and the Coca-Cola Company, the lot numbers were traced back to the store, the warehouse, and the bottling plant. The search came up clean. No other bottles had been tainted, and there'd been no other reports of poisoning. The tainted bottles were specific to the Carr's home. But who would have done it? A poisoner must have intimate contact with his victim's surroundings in order to plant the toxin. That's why most poisonings are done within families.
That's up for grabs.
And that's why suspicion fell on Pye Carr. Pye was Peggy's second husband. They'd been married only a few months when Peggy grew ill, but it seemed their honeymoon was long over. Mincy learned that just prior to the poisoning, the Carrs had an argument that resulted in Peggy spending the night in a hotel. The weekend her symptoms first appeared, Pye was conveniently out of town on a hunting trip. When he returned, he'd resisted taking his wife to the hospital. Everything seemed to point to Pye Carr. But convictions aren't made on such circumstantial evidence. Mincy's criminal investigation had just begun. More evidence needed to be gathered. More leads followed.
It's in here somewhere, fellas.
Carr's every move was scrutinized. Almost as an afterthought, he presented a convenient clue in his own defense. He showed detectives a threatening note he claimed he received 2 weeks before the poisoning. The Carrs didn't pay much attention to it at the time, but Pye kept it just in case.
This note indicated that ever who had written it wanted the entire family to move out of the state of Florida or else they would die.
The note, along with the fact that Pye Carr had consumed some of the tainted soft drink, weakened the accusations against him. But he wasn't home free yet. He could have written the note himself and taken the poison intentionally to deflect the pall of guilt. Mincy kept his eye on Pye Carr while he sought other suspects. Who would want to kill the family? Mincy learned that the Carrs didn't get along with their neighbors, George Tripal and his wife Diana. Several weeks before the poisoning, Peggy and Diana almost came to blows over the Carrs' loud music. It hardly seemed like grounds for attempted murder. To find out more about the icy relationship between the neighbors, Mincy paid a visit to George Tripal. Tripal's reaction to the subject of the Carrs was unexpectedly harsh.
He went into a tirade about the problems with these red-necked children and family that lived next door to him.
Their kids make all kinds of noise, play the radio real loud.
Then Mincy asked him why he thought anyone might want to harm the family.
He quoted the threatening letter the Carrs had received weeks before verbatim. He said exactly what was in the note. Nobody else knew of its existence, nobody else except law enforcement.
At that moment, George Tripal became the prime suspect. But Mincy had no more to go on with Tripal than he had with Pye Carr. So he began looking into Tripal's surprising past. Tripal was an eccentric man who enjoyed creating games and crafting scenarios. He also belonged to Mensa, an elite society of people whose IQs are among the top 2% in the world. He and his wife were trained chemists. What's more, the quirky genius had done time for masterminding one of the largest amphetamine manufacturing operations in the Southeast. Thallium is sometimes used to make amphetamines. According to John Trestrail, Tripal had the means and the mind to orchestrate a poisoning.
They can plan a script of a death. She'll be here and she'll be eating this, and then she'll do this and I'll do this, and it's all laid out. So I think this takes a great deal of intelligence to plan this out. This is not a brute force weapon. This is mind, not muscle.
But what would his motive be? In his prison records, Mincy found a letter Tripal wrote complaining to officials about his fellow inmates' radios. As hard as it was to believe, loud music seemed to be an overwhelming sore point for him. On March 3rd, 1989, Peggy Carr died after lingering in a coma for 3 months. Mincy now had to prove that Tripal was a murderer. With nothing but the flimsiest circumstantial evidence, Mincy couldn't get a search warrant for Tripal's house. The only way to crack this case was to outsmart the certified genius. After several months of background checks on George Tripal, Detective Mincy was confident he poisoned Peggy Carr. All he needed was proof. But Tripal was too clever to leave clues out in the open. Mincy needed to get inside his house and get inside his head. To carry it off, he needed someone to befriend the alleged killer, win his confidence, and then betray it. For this deadly game, he counted on Special Agent Susan Gorick. She became Sherry Gwynn, a woman on the verge of divorce who counted on Tripal's shoulders to cry on. She met him at a party that he organized for Mensa members. Its theme was murder.
I learned a lot about his personality and about his habits, about his associates. One of the things that I learned was that he did have a large ego. I did use my personality of Sherry to play off of that ego and to get him to talk more. And I used that to my advantage.
The friendship blossomed slowly, forcing Gorick to maintain her Sherry Gwynn persona for a full year. All the while, she lived in fear that Tripal would see through her masquerade, putting her life in danger. Slowly, she gathered what evidence she could to build her case, hoping he'd tip his hand. As the months went by, she didn't have much.
I gained a multitude of small evidence, small statements that all put together was overwhelming. But if you looked at one small statement, it did not look like a lot of evidence.
Like playing an excruciating game of hangman, Gorick slowly drew her picture of Tripal as the murderer. But even after a year, she was still waiting to add that final stroke essential to win the game. Finally, in December 1989, Gorick got the break she needed. Tripal and his wife moved out of town and allowed Sherry Gwynn to rent their house. As a tenant, she could search the entire property without a warrant. She'd gotten all she could out of Tripal. Perhaps now his house would give up his secrets. She called in the Polk County Crime Scene Unit. They combed the premises, collecting whatever they could find. Believing Tripal would be too smart to have kept any thallium around his house, they looked for its telltale residue.
I truly believed that if we were going to find thallium, that it would probably be either in the air conditioning filter or possibly down one of the drains. And we spent a lot of time with the crime scene people swabbing the drains, trying to get any residue that he may have poured out.
While some investigators were in the house looking for trace evidence, others collected vials of chemicals from the garage. Everything was labeled and sent to the FBI for analysis. Months went by before the results came back.
I assume because it took so long with the lab report that they didn't find anything.
But Gorick was wrong. When the reports came back, they showed that one of the vials, picked up from the workbench in Tripal's garage, contained thallium powder. For Gorick and Mincy, 15 months of deception paid off. The evidence to convict George Tripal of poisoning the cars was in hand. At Tripal's trial, it was clear that he was a killer without a conscience. Like the murder weekend party he organized, death was just a game to him.
George Tripal had absolutely no remorse for his actions. He justified it with his superior intelligence and the fact that people with lesser intelligence did not deserve to live on this planet.
Unlike most poisoners, Tripal's motive was neither love nor money. He wanted to kill his neighbors simply because he found them annoying. According to John Trestrail, the ego that led him to think so little of others ultimately led to his own demise.
The container containing the evidence was left in his home. Why would he do that? Here's a very intelligent man. Didn't he look down the road to say, I better get rid of this bottle? No, his ego said, they'll never get this far. They'll never figure out how this happened.
A jury found George Tripal guilty of 14 felony counts, including first-degree murder in the death of Peggy Carr. He was sentenced to death. As we go about our daily lives, most of us seldom think about the toxic world we live in. In the past, that lack of diligence provided the poisoner's greatest opportunity. But now, science is catching up. More than ever, unexplained deaths are viewed with suspicion, and in the lab, more of those suspicions are being justified. Police find a family murdered in their home. The victims are covered with strange marks. To catch the killer, forensics experts must find out what caused the wounds. A request for roadside assistance is a pretext for murder. Can telltale marks on a car battery connect the killer to the crime? Police are on the trail of a psychopath. Investigators must rely on an ordinary screwdriver to stop him in his tracks. Like fingerprints, tool marks found at a crime scene can single out a murderer. More than one killer has tripped himself up on his own tools of death. In January 1992, police responded to a call made by the neighbors of Juan and Olga Hernandez. They reported a violent commotion coming from their home. Upon entering, Chicago officers found the body of Juan Hernandez lying face down in the living room. He was apparently beaten and killed. As they cautiously searched the house, police entered the nursery. And discovered Olga Hernandez was also dead. Nearby lay the body of her 10-month-old daughter. The Hernandez home showed no signs of forced entry. The killer or killers left no clues to their identity. The detectives on Chicago's homicide squad had seen a lot of horrible crimes. But nothing in their experience could have prepared them for what they witnessed that night. From the brutality of the murders, it looked as though the killer had come there with the sole purpose of killing this family. Detective Richard Zuley was one of the detectives on the scene.
It was actually the worst beating I've ever seen. And initially, we couldn't tell whether or not it was just a beating or if there was a weapon, like a shotgun maybe involved, because there was just so much blood on the scene.
The medical examiner determined that the victims had been beaten to death with a weapon that left hundreds of U and J-shaped bruises. Neither the medical examiner nor the officers at the scene could identify what could have caused the peculiar marks. Zuley's partner, Detective John Murray, knew they had no chance of finding the weapon until they knew what it was.
Time is of the essence, because if we can identify what it was, and we were thinking of a meat tenderizer, a tire jack, all kinds of things, now it would be important to get back to the scene or the area of the murder to try to recover it.
Detectives knew that identifying what caused the marks was the first step to finding the killer.
171 dispatch, start rescue, code gray.
Whoever he was, he had thoroughly covered his tracks, leaving behind only the telltale wounds. Any tool leaves its mark on the object it manipulates. In police work, that principle is usually applied to firearms. To see if a particular gun had been used in a crime, a ballistics expert test fires it. The signature markings on the test-fired bullet are then compared with markings on the bullet retrieved from the crime scene. If the markings are the same, the case is made. When a tool is used in a beating death, the task is a similar one. By examining characteristics of a victim's wounds, experts can often prove that one tool and one tool only was the instrument of death. Hoping to identify the wounds on the bodies of Juan and Olga Hernandez, the medical examiner sent photos of the markings to the Chicago Police Crime Lab. Forensic investigator Bill Sherlock, an expert in firearms and tool mark identification, compared the marks against various tools.
Baby that was murdered in this case.
The wounds were consistent in size and shape, bruises left by a heavy object. But in the curved area at the bottom of each wound, the skin had been broken.
We weren't sure what type of tool it was. I was not aware of any tool that would make this kind of marks, any store-bought tool, any of the tools that are used by the various trades. So it was kind of a challenge to try and find out what made these particular markings.
After nearly a week of testing one kind of tool after another, Sherlock could not find an absolute match. The most likely weapon was the butt of an automatic pistol, but Sherlock wasn't completely satisfied with that conclusion. If used like a hammer, the butt of a pistol could have caused the bruises on the victim's skin, but not the lacerations.
The marks looked somewhat consistent with the marks from the butt of a gun. We couldn't explain why we had the tearing of the skin and why we had the shapes that we had.
A chance event provided Detective Zulli with a possible explanation. Off duty, he realized he held a likely answer in the palm of his hand.
At home one day, I was cleaning my gun. And as I slid the magazine out of the gun, I was cleaning it and looking at it, and I thought, gee, that's kind of similar in shape to the wounds.
With its magazine removed, the butt of a semi-automatic pistol would have thinner, sharper edges, more capable of leaving the marks seen on the murder victims. Without the magazine and its bullets, the gun would be lighter and less effective as a bludgeon. It would have taken longer to inflict fatal wounds. Sherlock tested his theory on a slab of modeling clay. The butt of a medium caliber pistol produced marks of the same size and shape as the wounds on the victims.
So now we kind of knew that we were looking for, that a gun was used to do this, but we still didn't know what gun or where or anything else. That came later.
Forensics had identified the type of weapon used to commit the crimes, but could it be linked to a killer? Tapping their sources, officers on the narcotics squad got a tip from a prostitute who'd heard something on the street. She told police that a woman named Patricia Johnson seemed to know about the killings. Her boyfriend was a known drug dealer, a Cuban named Reynaldo Travieso. Police brought him in for questioning. He refused to talk. Meanwhile, detectives checked the victims' phone records. On the night they were murdered, Juan and Olga Hernandez had ordered a pizza. Questioned by the police, the delivery man said that on the night of the killings, he recalled going to the address of Juan and Olga Hernandez. But when a woman answered the door, she told him she hadn't ordered a pizza. Police brought him to a lineup that included the suspect's girlfriend, Patricia Johnson. He recognized her as the woman who'd answered the door at the Hernandez home. When Johnson was told she'd been picked out of the lineup, she admitted being at the house that night. She told police Travieso was the killer. Her willingness to talk was a stark contrast to her boyfriend.
He was stoic and friendly and very polite, but a guy that could sit upright in a chair for hours and talk to you freely.
Murray questioned Travieso again. Years of interviewing suspects have taught the detective to read subtle gestures that could reveal more than words alone. But Travieso wasn't playing.
If you were conscious like we are very often on the body English, right. very, very important, this guy showed nothing, a real sociopath.
But police were sure he knew something. A witness had ID'd his girlfriend who had turned on him, and he was named by an informant. As detectives turned up the pressure, Travieso decided to come clean. The story had begun 2 years earlier when he and Juan Hernandez came over from Cuba together. They planned to get rich dealing drugs. But that wasn't how it worked out, at least for Hernandez.
Both were in the drug business. And as time went on, the murderer became quite a bit more successful in the drug trade than the victim.
In their first year of business, Travieso had supplied Hernandez with 1 kilo of cocaine to sell. The street value was approximately $20,000. But the drugs disappeared and the money never materialized. Travieso demanded payment, but Hernandez held him off. A month later, Travieso decided to give Hernandez a second chance and gave him another kilo to sell. But that too disappeared. Travieso had trusted Hernandez, and his trust had been betrayed. Now it was time to collect. Patricia Johnson's statement confirmed that Travieso had used the butt of his gun to kill Juan and Olga. The confessions had come as a surprise, but the law demands more than a confession to ensure a conviction. At trial, the defense could argue that a confession was coerced, or the defendant could recant it. To make their case, police needed to provide corroborating evidence. They needed to find the weapon. Johnson had told police she'd wrapped the gun in a plastic sack. From a moving car, she'd tossed it off a bridge into the river. To aid divers in their search for the weapon, Zuli and Murray crisscrossed the bridge, tossing out stones of similar size and weight as a medium caliber pistol.
John and I spent a day driving across that bridge with rocks about the same size and weight of a medium caliber weapon. And we drove across, throwing them out of the squad car and into the river, and noting that they were all landing about the same distance from the bridge in about the same place.
To coordinate their search, divers stretched polyester rope across the river, forming a grid. It took them less than half an hour to find the sack containing the gun, near the spot where Zuli and Murray had tossed their stones. The weapon was a .32 caliber semi-automatic pistol. With its magazine removed, police believed it could have caused the unusual wounds on the victims' bodies. But to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, the detectives needed harder evidence, evidence only a forensics expert could provide. Police divers in Chicago had found what they believed to be a murder weapon in a plastic bag. Cuban immigrant Juan Hernandez had taken drugs to sell on consignment, then never delivered the cash. Now, he, his wife, and his infant child were dead. Bill Sherlock of the Chicago Police Crime Lab attempted to establish the gun as the murder weapon. Not as a firearm, but as a tool used to bludgeon the victims to death. Sherlock had already determined that the unusual wounds on the victims' bodies were most likely caused by the butt of a semi-automatic pistol with its magazine removed.
As we're looking at the marks on the victims' heads, it's consistent with the tearing being with the front portion of the magazine well, the thinner metal, the side wall, and also the magazine release back here, the serration from the magazine release.
At first glance, Sherlock believed the pistol found by divers could have caused the wounds. To make a positive identification, he obtained a copy of the autopsy photographs, being sure they were exactly to scale. He then obtained a 1-to-1 transparency of the butt of the gun with its magazine removed. He placed the transparency over the life-size photograph of the wound. After closely comparing the gun's metal edges with the cuts on the victims, Sherlock felt he had a perfect match. His testimony could now remove any doubts about the statements of the two defendants. He'd forged an irrefutable link between them and the tool of death.
what it was invaluable for was in bringing this case into court and having a solid piece of expert testimony to present in court to the jurors and say, this is this because this is the results of my tests. It's a lot more powerful than Detective Zulli or Detective Murray standing there going, geez, it looks the same, I think it's the same. They were able to show conclusively that it was the same.
Reynaldo Travieso's pistol became a bludgeon by accident. He'd come to the home of Juan Hernandez, hoping one last time to get the money he was owed. But Hernandez didn't have enough. Travieso put the pistol to his head and pulled the trigger, but the magazine jammed. Enraged, he resorted to beating his victim. In the process, the gun magazine fell out. When the pizza man arrived, Travieso had already begun beating Juan Hernandez with the butt of his gun. But the unpaid debt hadn't been satisfied. After Juan was killed, Olga Hernandez would also die, along with the baby she did everything to protect.
And clearly, in examining the scene, it was apparent to us that Mrs. Hernandez was doing what she could to try to protect her child during the course of this attack. That involved a whole emotional thing that you have to deal with too on the scene. You know, when you recreate the scene and you're visualizing what happens, you're creating all this. So you can imagine the terror and the fear and everything else that was happening.
Hopefully we'll never see them on the street again.
No.
Tool mark evidence had made a critical difference in putting Reynaldo Travieso and Patricia Johnson behind bars. Both were sent to prison for life. In Louisiana in 1984, police had to rely on more subtle tool mark evidence to crack a case of murder. Responding to the report of a shooting in the small town of Zachary, 15 miles from Baton Rouge, police found a car with its hood raised, parked at the side of the road. Nearby lay the body of George Thompson, shot at close range with a shotgun. No one witnessed the shooting, and the killer left no obvious clues. But battery cables dangling from the front of the victim's car gave police an idea of what had happened. One end of the cables was still attached to the victim's battery. Had he been the one who needed a boost, or had he stopped to help someone else? The victim's car started without any problem. Apparently, he had pulled off the road to assist another driver. If police could find the second car, they might also locate the killer. A Baton Rouge detective visited the wife of the victim.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Detective Tom Harris. I just have a couple of questions to ask about your husband.
She had gone to church on the night of the murder. When she returned home around 10 p.m., her husband told her he had to help someone start his car. He left without saying exactly where he was going. According to Lois Thompson, her husband rarely went out that late. Whoever it was he was going to help must have been a close friend. Lois Thompson never saw her husband again. It seemed to police that the call for assistance was a trap. They suspected the killer may have lured the victim to the crime scene with a plea for help. If so, the battery cables might bear the killer's fingerprints. They were sent for examination to forensic expert Pat Lane of the Louisiana Crime Lab. He placed the cables in a fuming chamber designed to make latent fingerprints visible. But the test results were negative.
Well, we didn't come up with any fingerprints on any of the clamps or the cable. So essentially, the fingerprint examination was a washout, and I thought that I was going to be through with this evidence at that time.
The case stalled until a few days later, when detectives got a phone call that brought them a lead. The caller told police to check out a parking lot at an apartment complex in Baton Rouge. Police found a yellow Buick that matched the description of the second car observed by a passerby prior to the murder. It belonged to Brenda Perkins. The tip was placed by her neighbor, a relative of the victim. Faced with suspicion of involvement in a murder, Perkins was more than willing to talk to police. Detective Bernie Taylor of the Zachary Police was at the scene.
One of the questions that, naturally came up is, well, have you been having trouble with this car? Perhaps, battery trouble.
The car had a brand new battery. Perkins told police she'd had no trouble starting it.
So at this point here, we kind of fits in with our thought that, hey, this was a set-up deal with no car trouble to begin with. He just was lured out there under that pretense.
Perkins explained that her uncle, Earl Thomas, had borrowed the car on the night of the murder. Thomas was the brother-in-law of the murder victim. But Brenda Perkins had even more damaging evidence. The day of the murder, she'd gone shopping with Earl Thomas. He'd made only one purchase, shotgun shells. Perkins asked him why he needed them. At first, he said for hunting. But with deer season several weeks away, she prodded him to tell her the truth. He said he planned to murder his brother-in-law, the victim, George Thompson. A receipt found in the trunk of Perkins' car totaled $2.97 plus tax. Brenda had noticed both the size and brand name of the shells her uncle had purchased. To check out her story, the detectives went to the same store and purchased a similar box of shells. The amount on the receipt was $2.97 plus tax. Exactly the same as the receipt found in the car. Lane also found Thomas's thumbprint on the shopping bag. The detectives now had circumstantial evidence that Earl Thomas was the killer, but they required something more solid. They looked for what they needed under the hood of the victim's car. Through forensics, they hoped to turn a scratched piece of soft lead into hard evidence. In the murder of George Thompson, Louisiana police were building their case against his brother-in-law, Earl Thomas. Had Thomas set a trap for Thompson, calling for help and then killing him? The case was missing one crucial element: a way to link Thomas to the crime scene. Booster cables were still attached to the victim's car battery. If the victim had time to attach the cables to the killer's car, the clamps may have left marks on the battery. The battery of the car driven by the suspect, Earl Thomas, had fresh tool marks, apparently made by a booster cable. Police asked forensic examiner Pat Lane to see if the marks were made by the cables found at the crime scene. It was the only way to place the suspect's car at the scene. Just like people, every tool leaves behind a unique fingerprint that can be used to identify it. The suspect's battery not only had bite marks left by the teeth of a booster cable, it also had a scratch, apparently caused when the cable was hastily removed. Lane suspected that a single tooth on one of the jaws of the cable may have caused the scratch. To test his theory, he took the cable found at the crime scene and made test marks on a flat piece of lead. A comparison microscope enables him to examine two sets of marks at the same time. On one side were the marks on the suspect's battery clamp. On the other, the marks made by the victim's battery cables.
The ultimate determination in any tool mark examination is, was this tool or this instrument responsible for making a particular mark? And in this particular examination, my determination was the mark that we see on this clamp here in the monitor and this reference mark that I know to have been made by the jumper cables have the same source.
Tool mark evidence had placed the car driven by Earl Thomas at the scene of the crime. A warrant was issued for his arrest. But Thomas had gone to California. His address was unknown. Detectives traced all the calls he made to his sister in Baton Rouge to a public phone booth in East Los Angeles. Within days, he was picked up at the booth by Los Angeles police. They didn't have a hard time spotting him. He was a tall man, missing his left arm. Detective Bernie Taylor and his partner Charlie Clark had already pieced together how the killing occurred. The victim was married to Thomas's sister, but was being unfaithful. To uphold the family honor, Thomas decided to put a stop to his brother-in-law's philandering once and for all. He borrowed Perkins' car, then called the victim, pretending to need help. As the victim clamped a booster cable to the battery of Thomas's car, Thomas retrieved his shotgun.
I told you to leave her alone.
It was a nice theory, but Thomas denied any involvement in the crime. Detective Clark was concerned a jury might think a one-armed man incapable of firing a shotgun.
You ever do any hunting?
Oh yeah, I love to hunt.
Yeah.
Oh,
What kind of hunting you do? Deer? Squirrels?
Just generally hunting. It's just fun.
What kind of gun do you hunt with?
What shotgun?
But Thomas's gift for gab tripped him up.
Well, what do you think?
I think he's a con artist. Earl was a con artist. He rambled. If you ask him about the case, then he would start rambling on something else. And so we decided we knew that he did hunt. And so we started asking about his hunting. And so I asked him, well, Earl, how do you handle that shotgun when you only got one hand, you know? And Earl said, well, I just put this arm out like this and lay that shotgun on it here and steadied it. And he said, no problem.
Man, I told you to leave her alone, man. Don't do that to her, man.
Earl Thomas successfully entrapped his brother-in-law with his scheme. But the hunter also unwittingly snared himself. The scratches from the clamp marked Thomas as the killer.
This lead clamp, a $1.98 piece of lead, put a man in jail for 20 plus years. When Bernie Taylor brought this piece of evidence into the laboratory, I knew exactly what he wanted before he ever finished the request. And I told Bernie at that time, I said, Bernie, it's theoretically possible, but I have to tell you it's a long shot, but we'll give it our best shot. And ultimately, this piece of evidence was linked to not just one pair of jumper cables, not just one clamp, but to one tooth on one clamp of that pair of jumper cables.
Let you get back in, get set.
In the small town of Zachary, solid detective work turned a case of circumstantial evidence into a conviction based on forensic science.
And so the challenge to us is to find and to establish the link from the crime scene to that individual. And when that takes place, there's usually not cameras and lights, there's not a lot of glamour. There's a tremendous amount of satisfaction in going home at night and knowing that the work that I've done has made this town a little bit safer place to live in.
Thompson's death was the result of a personal vendetta. But in Florida in 1990, murder became a terrifyingly random event, and police were paralyzed by lack of clues. On August 26th, students were returning for the fall semester at the University of Florida in Gainesville. On that Sunday afternoon, Ricky and George Powell went to the campus to see their daughter Christina's new apartment. But when they arrived, neither their daughter nor her roommate answered the door or telephone. The parents asked the building manager to let them in, but the women had changed the lock. The manager didn't have a key. The Powells' concern grew with every hour their daughter was away. Fearing the worst, they contacted the police. A Gainesville police officer met them at the apartment. He then forced open the door. As he entered, he saw a dead woman posed on the couch. He blocked the parents from following him. He didn't want them to disturb the evidence, and he feared the killer might still be inside. But the officer found not the killer, but a second murder victim. Both women had been raped, then stabbed. The brutality of the crime and the way the bodies had been staged made police fear that they were dealing with more than a random killer. Whoever murdered these women was cunning and methodical. Police feared it would only be a matter of time before he struck again. To help investigate the brutal double slaying, police throughout the county assisted the Gainesville police. Among them was Detective Sergeant LeGrand Hewitt of the Alachua County Sheriff's Office. And then the killer struck closer to home.
About midnight, Sunday night, one of our records clerks at the Alachua County Sheriff's Office failed to show up for work. her supervisor and co-workers got concerned about that and notified our watch commander.
A deputy was sent to Krista Hoyt's apartment. No one came to the front door, but he saw a gap in her Venetian blinds.
The deputy got on his knees and put his flashlight up into the room that was there, and it happened to be Krista Hoyt's bedroom, and she was sitting on the side of the bed in a staged position, decapitated.
Adding to the horror, 2 days later, 2 more victims were found, raped and stabbed in a similar fashion. News of the killings electrified the University of Florida campus.
It's currently 27 minutes past the top of the hour. Just a reminder for University of Florida students back for the new semester, make sure you stay safe, keep doors and windows locked. Call SNAP, the Student Nighttime Auxiliary Patrol, if you need an escort around campus. Police are increasing patrols in the southwest Gainesville area around student apartment complexes.
Special Agent Ed Dix of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement recalls the mood in Gainesville at the time of the killings.
The city of Gainesville sort of started feeling a sense of terror, and the university has some 40,000 students, of which probably 20,000 or more are females. Parents started coming to get their children. It wasn't enough that they call for a well-being check. They actually just started showing up. The kids were calling home saying, "I'm ready to go," to the point that the university was closed for a week.
The police feared a ritual killer was on the loose. A serial madman who'd claimed 5 victims in 3 days. In each case, he forced his way past the locks on the doors. At the first location, he jimmied the lock of a wooden door. At the second and third locations, he'd removed the security pin from a sliding glass door. Special Agent Ed Dix believed the same tool had been used at the last 2 locations.
The sliding glass door had been broken and pried and had left some marks in the aluminum.
The police photographed the damaged areas around each of the sliding doors where the killer had gained entry. A section of the wooden door frame from the first location also was removed and sent to toolmark examiner David Warniment at the crime lab in Jacksonville. Experience told Warniment immediately what class of tool had been used to enter the victims' homes.
And the question was what type of tool was used to make the damage in the door sections from the first crime scene. I looked at them and could tell the investigators initially that they were looking for a 5/16 inch screwdriver with a type of blade that has a serrated tip or a corrugated type of tip on it.
Police removed the doors from the second and third crime scenes and sent them to the lab. They suspected the crimes were linked, but had no evidence to prove it. If they could match the tool marks found at the 3 crime scenes, they could prove the same person was responsible.
A week later, 2 doors came into the laboratory. The door from the second crime scene and the door from the third crime scene. I looked at the doors and found that there was damage around the lock on the door from the second crime scene and also on the door jamb which came in with it. On the door from the third crime scene, there was also damage around the lock. And also I found that there was damage up around the security pin. There was a series of scratches in the security pin, around the security pin hole. And what I noticed was they were very typical, and they appeared to have been caused by trying to jimmy the door and remove the security pin and gain entry.
Warniment made a silicone cast of the damage on each of the doors. The silicone is mixed with a hardening agent. When it sets, it forms a perfect impression. After studying the impressions from the 3 crime scenes, Warnament concluded that the killer used a screwdriver with a 5/16" serrated blade. Police now knew that they were dealing with one killer who used the same screwdriver to break into his victims' homes. If they could find the screwdriver, they would find the killer. Over the next 4 months, throughout Florida, if a suspect was arrested with a screwdriver on his person or in his car, the tool was sent to David Warnament. Examined under a microscope, even the blade of a brand new screwdriver leaves a striated mark that's totally unique. It becomes more distinctive over time, acquiring the nicks and scratches that come from use. But after examining dozens of screwdrivers, Warnament found nothing that matched the tool marks at the crime scene. Police had few leads and no immediate suspects. A killer was on the loose, and they feared that more women would die. In November of 1990, 4 months after the first murder in Gainesville, police got a break from a routine computer check. A man picked up in Ocala for robbery was wanted in Shreveport, Louisiana for shooting his father. The computer had already identified Shreveport as the scene of a crime very similar to the murders in Gainesville. It might be a coincidence. But Special Agent Ed Dix decided to look for a connection between the suspect in Ocala and the Gainesville murders. Meanwhile, Sergeant Detective LeGrand Hewitt was following a different lead. Months earlier, shortly after the murders, a bank in Gainesville had been robbed. It was not far from the second murder scene. Shortly after the robbery, police officers saw 2 men enter the woods nearby. The suspects eluded police, who called for backup. A tracking dog was dispatched to pick up the scent. It led police to a small makeshift campsite. There, they found a large number of dye-marked bills, apparently stolen in the bank robbery that day. In a duffel bag, police found a semi-automatic weapon like the one used by the robber, some duct tape, and a cassette player. On the tape was what seemed to be a veiled message. The man on the tape identified himself as Danny Rolling. He sang a total of 11 songs he'd written himself, mostly to the tune of The House of the Rising Sun. The tape ended with what was possibly the chilling prelude to murder. "This is not the road I wanted, but I will walk it like a man. I got something I gotta do." The tape proved that Rolling had been in Gainesville at the same time the killings occurred.
Looks like some blood on the gloves.
At the campsite, police had also found a screwdriver. But at the time, there had been no reason to suspect Rolling's involvement in murder. His apparent MO was bank robbery, a crime far removed from brutal sex crimes. At first, the screwdriver wasn't examined.
The investigators had said it was essentially a screwdriver from a campsite that was occupied by a bank robber. And at that time, no one attached any significance to the campsite. But there was evidently something in the back of my mind that just said, told me not to eliminate the tool.
Warnament decided to take a closer look at the screwdriver.
I placed the tests on the from the screwdriver from the campsite on the microscope, and also my silicone casts of the marks from the door from the third crime scene. And within about 5 or 10 minutes, I all of a sudden saw a tremendous correspondence of individual characteristics and thought to myself, I've just identified this screwdriver as making the damage on the door from the third crime scene.
He performed a similar test on the sliding door from the second crime scene.
And again, compared them directly to the screwdriver blade in this case, and I was able to see enough correspondence to say that the screwdriver from the campsite caused the damage on the door and the door jamb from the second crime scene.
The tool marks proved that the screwdriver found at Danny Rolling's campsite was the same tool used to break into the victim's apartments. Faced with the mounting evidence against him, Rolling decided to reveal the criminal life he'd led. As a burglar, he developed a talent for breaking and entering houses while the occupants were asleep.
His whole life, I suppose since he was a teenager, he had spent as a peeping Tom, and then as a burglar, and then as a rapist, and he was an extremely good burglar. He seemed to enjoy breaking in with people in the house, the cat burglar scenario, and enjoyed being able to go in there and do whatever he wanted to do without waking anyone up.
Like so many other serial killers, Rollings had begun as a peeping Tom, peering in women's windows in the dark. Then he became a cat burglar and progressed to murder. His break-in tool of choice was a screwdriver with a serrated blade 5/16 of an inch wide. He was proud of his ability to open any door without a sound. From there, it was apparently one short step to rape, then murder, culminating on the night of August 26, 1990.
He said as he was peeping in the windows, he saw a girl changing clothes or just come from the shower, which turned out to be Tracy Paulus. And he said when he saw her, he knew that she was the one, his choice for the evening.
The knife Rolling used to kill his victims was never recovered. Instead, police had found a much more valuable tool. Rolling had left 27 scratch marks on the doors at the crime scenes. It was more than enough to prove his guilt.
It is further ordered and adjudged that the defendant, Danny Harold Rawling, is hereby sentenced to death. The defendant is hereby committed to the Department of Corrections of the state of Florida for execution of this sentence as provided by law. May God have mercy on his soul. Done and ordered this 20th day of April, 1994.
Tool mark identification is perhaps the simplest weapon in the Crime Stopper's arsenal. Requiring little more than a visual comparison. But for juries, it's compelling evidence. If a tool can be traced to a suspect, only a few faint scratches may be enough to solve the crime. A young woman falls to her death from a rugged California cliff. Months after she's buried, an investigator suspects she was pushed. Researchers try to determine a woman's cause of death 3,000 years after she died. How can they perform an autopsy without destroying her fragile, mummified shell? To catch a murderer, detectives must prove that a few splinters of bone are the remains of a woman who disappeared 2 years earlier. Time doesn't heal all wounds, a fact that keeps relentless detectives on the trail of cold or forgotten cases. With cutting-edge technology, forensic experts are able to travel back in time, months, years, or millennia, to coax mysteries out of the grave. From San Diego to San Francisco, California's coastal highways are some of the most magnificent drives in the world. Heading north, stretches of glittering sand and crowded freeways gradually give way to a vastly different landscape. As Highway 1 winds through the Monterey Peninsula, mountains collide with the sea in a majestic alliance of power and beauty. In Big Sur, California, the huge sky and boundless Pacific Ocean seduce visitors to the edge of the dizzying cliffs for a breathtaking view of the edge of the world and a snapshot by which to remember it. But sometimes the pull is too strong. On April 2nd, 1987, the Monterey County Sheriff's Department received a phone call that something horrible had happened at the Seal Beach Overlook. The body of a 20-year-old woman named Dina Hubbard Wild was lying near the base of a 600-foot precipice. It was not the first time the search and rescue squad had been dispatched to collect the remains of a victim lured too close to the edge. A deputy from the sheriff's office questioned the middle-aged couple waiting at the scene. They were Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, tourists from San Diego. They told the officer that their young companion had tumbled over silently when they weren't looking. The rescue squad retrieved the lifeless body from the bottom of the cliff. After a cursory examination by the coroner, Dina Wild was returned to her hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, and buried. At the Second Presbyterian Church in Louisville, Dina Wild's freak accident was still on people's minds months after she'd been buried. When services ended one Sunday, Dina's mother, Bobby Roberts, approached a lawyer named Steve Keeney. She needed help collecting insurance money after her daughter's death.
She wanted to collect burial insurance that she had as part of her benefits as a teacher, and the insurance company had told her no. We told her that sometimes a letter from a law firm cuts through the red tape, we'd give it a try.
Keeney knew that Bobby could really use the $3,500. He agreed to make a few phone calls for her on his own time. Keeney called Bobby's insurance company and uncovered the source of the holdup. They had never received Dina's death certificate. Keeney then called the Monterey coroner's office requesting a copy of the death certificate. But when the document arrived, it listed the cause of death as pending. Because Dina's death was presumed to be an accident, the rescue team had done little beyond retrieving the body. No evidence was collected, no photographs were taken. The body was sent to the Monterey coroner's office. Its analysis found no hint of foul play. Bobby Roberts' simple request was snowballing into a time-consuming tangle of bureaucracy. But Keeney pressed on. He contacted Monterey law enforcement only to discover that the case was in limbo. The certificate couldn't be issued until cause of death was determined, but the sheriff's department had, for all intents and purposes, dropped the case for lack of evidence. Dina had been dead for months. What could be holding things up? Keeney called Bobby's insurance company again to see if there was some way of expediting Bobby's payment.
When we called back, we stumbled into a fact that we never expected. That was that there was life insurance on Dina in someone else's name, and they had made a claim for that policy.
The amount that you're looking for is $35,000?
That claimant was none other than Virginia McGinnis, the woman with whom Dina had spent her final hours. Just a day before Dina's death, Virginia had taken a $35,000 policy out on the young woman. The day after Dina's death, she had tried to cash in. In Keeney's mind, Dina's accidental tumble was swiftly transforming into something more sinister. But without a witness or a body, how could he distinguish between a tragic fall and a push?
Ask yourself, how do you prove someone was pushed off a cliff? Imagine you're standing at the edge of the cliff and you fall. Think of the injuries. You'll be battered, there'll be broken bones, there'll be bruises on your body will end up at the foot of the cliff. And now put yourself back at the cliff and imagine you're pushed. Same thing, right? Same bruises, same broken bones. Well, not quite.
The suspicion that Dina may have been shoved over the edge was a chilling hypothesis, but it was still just speculation. To prove any wrongdoing, Keeney needed evidence. He went back to basics, trying to learn more about Dina's relationship with the older couple. Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, the parents of one of Dina's friends, had taken her into their San Diego home after she was separated from her husband. Dina's loneliness was relieved in the fun-filled months she'd spent with her surrogate parents. She was known for her blind devotion to new friends. Had she been duped by the McGinnis's kindness? To check his suspicions, Keeney secured a copy of the autopsy report from the Monterey coroner's office. In the report, he noticed something unusual. A blood test revealed the presence of a drug called amitriptyline, commonly known as Elavil. The antidepressant had never been prescribed to Dina. It had, however, been prescribed to Virginia's husband, B.J. Toxicologist Catherine Ham retested a vial of Dina's blood that had been frozen after her autopsy. Her job was to check for levels of the drug. Keeney hoped that if a crime was committed, it could be proven in the lab.
I think that a lot of people that commit crimes underestimate what we can do in the laboratory.
To test for the presence of chemicals in the blood, Ham adds a solvent into the sample. The tube is rocked for 20 minutes as the drugs move out of the blood and into the solvent. The solvent is then removed from the tube and evaporated. The reconstituted solvent is injected into a gas chromatograph, an instrument that separates compounds according to their chemical properties. Ham compared the standard for the drug and the products of its breakdown with the chromatograph of Dina's blood. They matched. Having been frozen for so long, Dina's blood was degraded. Ham was unable to determine exactly when Dina had taken the drug, or exactly how much she'd taken. What she did know was that Dina Wild had Elavil in her system when she died. With its disorienting and unpleasant side effects, it was hardly the kind of medication that Dina might have popped for a quick buzz. People taking the drug are usually stricken with weakness, nausea, and dizziness. These symptoms would be more pronounced in individuals who, like Dina, didn't take the medication on a regular basis. As he learned about Elavil's effects, Keeney realized that he needed to revise his image of Dina's last moments of life. If she'd been as queasy and unsteady as Ham suggested, she most likely would have slid down the mountain, not plunged. Though no crime scene photos had been taken, the period of time before the fall was well documented. Virginia had sent Dina's mother the roll of snapshots from the day of the accident as a gesture of condolence. Could these posed snapshots tell Keeney about the cause of Dina's death? At first glance, the 15 chronological pictures told the story of an average sightseeing junket. Dina seemed comfortable and happy as she posed for the camera. But as Keeney studied the pictures more carefully, he suspected that he was witnessing a murder plot.
The photograph of Virginia and B.J. McGinnis walking away from the car was taken by Dina Wild, and it is a signature photo. It's at the cliff where she would die a few minutes later. It's when the Ellaville has kicked in and she knows something's wrong. She's leaving a note to the rest of us that will survive her. It's like an assault victim who takes their own blood and writes the name of their assailant. She's pointing the finger.
The Ellaville had clearly taken effect in the subsequent picture. Dina's bright eyes had grown dull. Her features slackened. She seemed unable to stand on her own. When Keeney got to picture 11, the first thing that came to his mind was Dina knows. What at first seemed an innocuous cliffside stroll revealed upon closer examination the terrifying moment before Dina's death.
At that lip, you can see Dina's shoes pointing toward the boulders, in toward the road, but you can see her head in a blur, turning as she realizes her body is getting pushed that way. And as she looks, like you would if you were pushed, as she looks where she's going, the photo blurs. There are no features of her face at all. But her shoes still point to BJ, the guy she trusted.
Moments later, she would be dead. To Keeney's way of thinking, the bizarre and disturbing circumstances of Dina's death were leading to a single conclusion.
Once you know a 20-year-old dies with 55-year-old strangers at her side, and you know that those strangers bought a life insurance policy on her, in your heart, don't you believe that that's almost bound to be a murder?
Armed only with a handful of photos and a hunch, Keeney was a long way from proving murder. He knew he would need some help. In Louisville, Kentucky, Steve Keeney revisited Dina Wild's autopsy report, looking for a shred of evidence to support his murder hypothesis. The Monterey coroner had determined the cause of Dina's death to be a skull fracture. He surmised that she lost her footing because of her high-heeled shoes. In his opinion, there was nothing suspicious about the circumstances of the so-called accident. Keeney wasn't so sure. He wondered if there was anything in the coroner's slim findings that suggested otherwise. Keeney brought the autopsy photos to forensic pathologist Barbara Weekley-Jones. Could her analysis of the pictures differentiate a murder from an accident?
Steve Keeney was surprised when I told him some of the injuries were suggestive of not just an accidental death. Describe any on one hand.
The only fatal injury on Dina's body was a blow to the head, yet the right side of her body had linear scrape marks. To Weekley-Jones, those lacerations suggested a limp slide, not a head-first plummet. Dina's bruised hands provided the most telling physical evidence. They hadn't sustained the kinds of injury typical in a fall. Her acrylic nails were snapped off, ragged, and embedded with granite, suggesting she'd clawed at the edge of the cliff, trying to save her life. Or perhaps she'd fought before she plunged to her death. In addition to the torn nails, both hands were marred by a very suspicious wound pattern.
But they had huge hematomas, black and blues, on the tops around her knuckles. Those you get when somebody steps on your hand, if you're holding the edge of a cliff.
Keeney wondered if Dina's broken skull was the result or the cause of her terrible fall. The top of the cliff sloped gently for the first few yards. If Dina had been trying to save herself, she no doubt would have grabbed at a rock or a tree root. But her palms showed no injuries, no signs of clutching at anything.
And look, she had fingernails. It looks like artificial fingernails.
Weekly Jones's findings substantiated Keeney's theory of an intentional push and a limp slide.
But that's not proof of homicide. So what else do you do? Well, the old phrase is, circumstances don't lie, people do.
There you go.
Keeney needed to take a close look at the suspects, Virginia and B.J. McGinnis.
Well, they come up
Had this pleasant, middle-aged couple really plotted to do away with Dina? Were they truly capable of pushing their young friend off a 600-foot cliff? As he probed the backgrounds of his prime suspects, Keeney uncovered a trail of death and deception. Virginia's rap sheet was a lot bloodier than Keeney had anticipated. Though the former nurse could affect a saccharine persona, her past suggested a cold, psychopathic profile that included compulsive lying, arson, and cruelty to animals. In addition to the accidental deaths of her daughter and second husband, Virginia's parents and several of her patients had died of unknown causes while in her charge. She frequently benefited from their life insurance policies. Keeney compiled this information into a lengthy report. It wasn't enough evidence to arrest Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, but it was enough to get the case reopened in California. Because the McGinnises had purchased Dina's insurance policy in San Diego, the district attorney's office in that jurisdiction became involved. Investigator Scott Lawrence took the baton from Steve Keeney. Like the Louisville attorney, he was compelled to make sense of Dina's fall. But Dina's case didn't have the benefit of much physical evidence. Lawrence attempted to disprove the theory of an accidental tumble by recreating Dina's trajectory. It was more than a year and a half after Dina's death, so any blood or geographic disturbance from her fall would have been washed away. The only thing Lawrence knew for sure was where she landed. What he needed to determine was where the fall started.
Well, one of the things that we had to look into was where we knew she was last standing at this turnout, almost within a few feet of where I'm at. That's based upon testimonial evidence as well as photographic.
Based on Lawrence's assessment, this wasn't a place where a person was likely to lose her footing, even in high-heeled shoes. The ground was relatively flat and solid. Now, Lawrence could recreate Dina's path down the cliff. Though he was a novice rock climber, his fierce commitment to the truth compelled him down the cliff face with a video camera in hand. From his topographic analysis, Lawrence believed that Dina was dead or near death when she lost her grip on the edge of the overlook. For one thing, the first section of the cliffside was not a sheer drop. Had Dina accidentally fallen here, she probably would have been able to stop her descent. She probably would have screamed. After the initial slope, the cliff drops off suddenly. Lawrence experimented to see how fast and by which route Dina was likely to have descended.
So we could take individual rocks and toss them down, and you get a pretty good idea of how you would accelerate once you got past the incline and once you made that first precipice about 40 or 50 feet down to my right, down toward the ocean.
Had Dina free-fallen off the precipice, she would have hit the bottom in excess of 120 miles per hour. Yet her body was in one piece, with no tumbling marks and relatively few fractures. Lawrence's research corroborated Weekly Jones's analysis of the body. Dina went down the cliff in a slow, limp slide, not an accelerating, high-speed tumble. Lawrence's careful recreation of the fall didn't jibe with the story relayed by the McGinnises.
So we tried many ways to interpret what could have happened, and the bottom line is there's always unknowns, and the people that know aren't talking.
By September of 1989, police gathered enough incriminating evidence to arrest the McGinnises. For the trial, the Cliffside Overlook was transformed into an outdoor courtroom. Scott Lawrence's careful recreation had a profound impact on the jury. The odyssey begun in Steve Keeney's office ended when the jury found Virginia McGinnis guilty of conspiracy, first-degree murder, insurance fraud, forgery, and murder for financial gain. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. B.J. McGinnis had died of pneumonia before the trial began. The inconsistencies in the so-called accidental death of Dina Hubbard Wild had been untangled to reveal a cold-blooded murder, despite the fact that neither the body nor the crime scene had been preserved. For experts hoping to solve old murders, keen analysis of the meager traces left behind means the difference between overdue justice and a death that is forever lost in time. For 7 years, Susan Davis endured an unsatisfying marriage with a struggling insurance salesman named Ralph. Leaving was always on her mind, but she never got very far from their Columbia, Missouri home. Then, one evening in June 1985, after a long day at her secretarial job, she climbed into her Ford Escort and drove off, never to be seen again. When she failed to show up for work the next day or answer phone calls, her mother contacted the police. Officers from the Boone County Police Department questioned relatives and searched the Davis home, but found nothing to indicate that Susan had been taken against her will.
Yes, I'm so worried.
Some people believed Susan's departure was her way of making a clean break from a life that had gotten too painful and messy. At the time of her disappearance, Susan had finally succeeded in making some big changes. She'd separated from Ralph and sent her 2 children, Robbie and Angela, to live with her parents in Iowa.
And what was his occupation?
Perhaps she was starting her life over in some other part of the country. Captain Larry McCrae led the investigation.
Ralph Davis told us that when Susan disappeared that she had a boyfriend and she'd probably gone off to Texas, and someday she'd show back up.
Susan was officially declared a missing person. In her absence, Ralph moved back into the house, brought his children home from their grandparents, and settled into the life of a single father. The family waited in vain for Susan's return. As his finances dwindled, Ralph went to court to make sure that if Susan did resurface, she'd be compelled to pay him child support. But there were still no clues as to her whereabouts and diminishing hope that she'd ever return. But as McCrae came to realize, Ralph Davis's victimized spouse routine was a feeble charade. The more he probed police files, the more McCrae came to realize what an abusive husband Ralph had been. For the duration of their marriage, Susan had lived in the wake of Ralph's ferocity. Then, one night in 1985, a few months before her disappearance, she'd reached the breaking point. Fearing for her life and the safety of her children, she garnered the strength to call the police. Ralph was arrested.
We investigated a case where Ralph had beat her up. We'd photographed, and at that time, there was an ex parte on her, which says, Ralph, you cannot go back to your home. You have to stay away from Susan and the kids.
A short stay in jail did little to calm Ralph. He had been boiling mad when he was released on bail. Then Susan disappeared. Ralph's violent tendencies gave credence to the theory that Susan had left him and covered her trail to ensure her safety. But for McCrae, the pieces still weren't adding up. Why hadn't this devoted mother contacted her children? Why hadn't she checked in with her frantic mother to let her know that she was all right? McCrae suspected he was looking at something more ominous than a woman in search of a happier life. McCrae believed that Ralph Davis wasn't telling the whole story. But without any evidence, the police had no course of action. There was no body. There were no leads. Even Susan's car had disappeared. McCrae's only option was to dig in and hope that one day a clue would surface. He didn't imagine that the waiting game would play out for so long. It had been 2 years since Susan Davis climbed into her car and vanished. Whether she left town intentionally or met a horrible fate remained an unanswered question. Captain McCrae's investigation met a dead end. Then one day, the owner of a storage facility took the locks off a unit rented by a customer who'd stopped paying his bills. Inside was a Ford Escort with the driver's side window blown in. The name of the delinquent customer was none other than Ralph Davis.
That's McCrae.
Captain McCrae was contacted. A quick run of the vehicle ID and tags confirmed it was Davis's car. McCrae took a look inside and was struck with a terrible sight.
When we approach the car and we look inside of it, we're pretty sure that somebody died in that car.
Blood and tissue spattered the dashboard, seats, and visors. Glass shards mingled with spent bullet shells on the car floor. 2 feeble air fresheners added a grim irony to the grisly scene. After 2 years of sitting on his hands, McCrae could finally move in on his prime suspect, Ralph Davis. Davis came up with a story to explain away the car. Before blowing out of town, he said, Susan had paid him one last visit. She was armed. Ralph overpowered her, pulled her out of the car, and climbed behind the wheel. As he drove away, he claimed, Susan smashed the window with her arm, bloodying the glass. The implausible account did little to explain how bits of body tissue got into the car. Davis was arrested. Experience told McCrae that he'd just detained a brutal murderer, but proving that in court would be another matter, especially when the crime scene was 2 years old. A successful forensic investigation would take a 2-pronged approach. First, McCrae's team would have to establish that a murder had in fact taken place in the car, and secondly, they'd have to identify the victim. McCrae believed he was looking at the remains of Susan Davis, but he was a long way from proving it. From the pattern of blood in the car, preliminary crime scene reconstruction determined that the victim had been shot inside the vehicle.
On the floor of the car, we found glass, basically moving inward, which would indicate that a shot or something had gone through that and from the outside. As we looked at the glass, we found that the glass was on the floorboard, and on top of the glass was blood.
It seemed that the shot came through the window, striking the driver in the head. The force sent the victim toward the other side of the car, crashing first into the rearview mirror hard enough to crack the windshield. From the amount of blood and brain tissue found in the car, the medical examiner determined that someone had died here. The automobile was towed to a private storage lot where McRae's team could try to make sense of the disarray. Because they didn't know what was evidence, they erred on the side of caution and collected everything.
Do you see, is there something back over, see back over?
Armed with specialized tools, apparel, and collection bottles, the investigators began to take the car apart, piece by piece, carefully cataloging each fragment of bone, tissue, and each smear of blood. Bullets were dislodged from the interior of the car. They matched shotgun shells found in Ralph Davis's home. A vacuum with sterile filters was used to collect the tiniest pieces of evidence. Like high-tech car vandals, the team stripped the escort down to the bare bones, bagging everything from the steering wheel to the carpeting for further analysis. At the University of Missouri's Human Skeletal ID Lab, bits of debris, some metal, some glass, some unidentified, were delivered in a matchbox to anthropologist Sam Stout. If human bone fragments were present in the jumbled findings, Stout would know how to unlock their secrets.
My work as an anthropologist was probably important in this case because as anthropologists we're often called upon to analyze bone specimens. We're probably the most familiar with pieces of bone, fragments of bone, whether it be a 2 million year old fossil to a modern cemetery.
33 fragments, none longer than a quarter inch, were separated into little plastic caps.
Bone specimens to embed in plastic and then we'll...
Because the findings were so small, it was nearly impossible to determine by sight whether they were bone. To be sure, Stout needed to examine the samples under a microscope. First, they needed to be prepared for viewing. To make slides, Stout's assistant embeds each fragment in plastic. As the air in the vacuum chamber is drawn away, the plastic impregnates the sample, then hardens. The embedded specimen is cut into slices as thin as cellophane. Each slice is then smoothed and placed on a glass slide for viewing. Microscopic analysis of the cross-sections told Stout that he was, in fact, looking at human bone. Stout knew where the fragments came from, a human skull. Dr. Stout had determined that the meager scrapings from the floor of Susan Davis's car were in fact human facial bones. Now he wanted to see if there was anything unique about the bone fragments that could tie them to Susan Davis and her death. Stout noticed that there were some smudges on the bone fragments. He sent them to the geology department at the University of Missouri lab. A scanning electron microscope revealed that traces of lead had been embedded in the bone. The presence of antimony indicated that gunpowder was involved as well. This victim had been shot. The close scrutiny of these fragments was turning the cloudy details into a vivid portrait of murder. But how could Stout link the bone to Susan Davis? Stout noticed an odd characteristic. Beyond the lead smudges was another lighter discoloration in the bone. In Stout's experience, that pattern indicated that the victim had been taking tetracycline. To test for the antibiotic, he exposed the bone to fluorescent light. If the drug were present, the bone would glow.
We saw the actual fluorescing of tetracycline, and upon seeing that, I suggested that they examine the records to see if Susan Davis had a prescription for tetracycline.
Dr. Stout estimated that the victim had been taking the drug for at least 3 months before death. McCrae knew from the original search of Susan's home that she'd been prescribed tetracycline at the time of her death. Stout had shown that the remains in the car were from the face of a person who was taking tetracycline. But McCrae needed irrefutable proof that this was Susan Davis. Without it, Ralph Davis would likely go free.
The missing link was, whose body was it? We all felt that it was Susan, but that's not evidence that you can take to court.
No murderer in the state of Missouri had ever been convicted without a body, so McCrae had a double burden. Before he could prove that Ralph Davis was a killer, he'd have to prove that Susan Davis was the victim. The finishing touches of the investigation would have to be drawn in blood. Could bloodstains link a 2-year-old crime scene to the death of Susan Davis? It was forensic serologist Lori Maloney's job to find out. Carpeting, sun visors, and upholstery from the interior of the car were sent to her at the Missouri State Highway Patrol lab. If she could determine that blood on these items came from Susan Davis, it would be nearly impossible for Ralph Davis to evade prosecution. But, as Maloney knew, irrefutable victim identification is tricky business. She needed to run a series of tests to find out exactly whose blood this was. Above all, she needed to be precise, to check and cross-check her results. Maloney's first task was to swab the samples to make sure that the stains found in the car were truly blood. The test turns green when blood is present. Maloney then needed to confirm that the blood was human. She added human antibody to the samples. When human blood and human antibody come in contact, they react, forming a thin white line. Maloney's results were consistent with McCrae's theory that someone had been killed in the vehicle.
I found on the evidence human blood detected on the carpeting and the seat belt latches. Also, I found human protein on the sun visors.
But how could she prove that the remains had come from Susan Davis? She had no samples of Susan's blood or tissue to compare them with. Paternity tests are commonly used to establish a man's parenthood by comparing his DNA with that of the child and its mother. By applying that standard procedure in a creative new way, a reverse paternity test, Maloney hoped to simulate Susan Davis's genetic profile. Every child gets half his DNA from his mother, half from his father. Subtracting DNA bands that the father and child have in common leaves a barcode representing the mother's genetic signature.
The remaining bands would then be used to compare to the crime scene evidence, and if those were matching to the crime scene evidence, the blood could have originated from the mother, Susan Davis.
Using this procedure, Ralph Davis's DNA pattern was subtracted from his children's. The resulting bands were a close simulation of Susan Davis's genetic fingerprint. This banding pattern matched the samples found on the Ford Escort's carpet. Susan Davis had been killed in her car. The ghostly fingerprint of a woman who'd vanished years earlier was returning to solve her murder.
What I think happened to Susan Davis was that she was going to leave this area to some safe haven because of Ralph's harassing her, stalking, and she was packing her car, backed up to the front of the house, loading her clothes in it when Ralph came around the house. She saw Ralph, got in the car, locked it up, and Ralph came up and shot her through the driver's side window.
Thanks to astute forensic analysis and an exacting recreation of the grisly death scene, prosecutors convinced the jury that Ralph Davis had killed his estranged wife in her car. It was a landmark decision in Missouri, one that saw Ralph Davis get the death penalty, even though the whereabouts of his victim is a mystery to this day. In the Susan Davis case, investigators had to revisit a crime that happened 2 years earlier without the benefit of a body. In Canada, investigators faced a similar but even stranger challenge: to determine what killed a woman 3,000 years ago. They had the body, but to touch it would be to destroy it. At the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, a mummy named Jedame-Sank, or Jed, has stood in silent vigil for decades. Her secrets wrapped tightly inside her delicate sarcophagus. Museum visitors and scientists alike are fascinated by her mysterious beauty and eager to know more about how she lived and died. From the elaborate drawings on her cartonnage, the shell of linen and glue in which her mummy is encased, we know only scattered details of her life. Nearly 3,000 years ago, Jed, a musician at the Temple Amun-Re, lived a prosperous life on the east bank of the Nile.
So that she will not want.
Ancient Egyptians celebrated life after death, but it could only be attained if they departed this world in the prescribed fashion. The journey to the land of the gods would be strenuous and dangerous. In order for the soul to survive the trip, the body needed to be strong. Mummification was the answer. A marriage of science and religion, the mummification process followed a strictly detailed procedure that took approximately 10 weeks to complete. After death, the body was cleansed and anointed. A single slit was made in the abdomen. Then the internal organs were removed and preserved in jars. Natron, a powdery drying agent made up of salt and sand, was heaped over the body. In the arid heat of the Egyptian sun, the body would completely desiccate in 40 days. The skin was rubbed with oils and resin to keep it supple. Linen stuffing was inserted in the body cavities to maintain lifelike contours. The corpse was adorned with makeup and funerary jewelry. Then the arduous task of wrapping began. In an effort to know more about these ancient people, many researchers, like pediatrician Peter Lewin, have found themselves compelled to unwrap the mysterious packages.
In the olden days, we would break up this casket, tear off the bandages of the individual inside who's mummified, break up the tissues to examine genetic material, chemistry, and any diseases, and in essence destroy a mummy, which is invaluable to humanity.
Lewin grew up in Egypt and has maintained a lifelong fascination with mummies. Today, in addition to his work at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, he is a leading researcher in the field of paleopathology.
Paleopathology is really the study of diseases of ancient man, and that can be done by examining the bodies themselves, and also can be done by the latest use of X-ray technology.
How could Dr. Lewin see into the life of this mummy and learn why she died without desecrating the sanctity of her death? X-ray technology known as computerized axial tomography, or CT scanning, was the answer to Lewin's dilemma. The machine produces cross-sectional images of the body without touching it. When the slices are stacked together, a three-dimensional image is rendered. Dr. Lewin was assisted by CT technician Stephanie Holoka. Lewin, who pioneered the use of the technique to slice into mummies without using a knife, first scanned Jed in 1978. But the technology was in its infancy, and he was barely able to distinguish the ancient body from the dense packing material. Nearly 20 years later, he was ready to try again. Because the patient was already dead, Holoka didn't need to worry about radiation levels. That freedom enabled her to take numerous pictures at very small increments. She scanned the body in 5mm slices and went to 3mm increments for the head and neck. Even greater detail was used to image the ears and eyes. 300 two-dimensional images were taken during the 4 hours of scanning. Glimpses of Jed came through in these X-rays, but it wouldn't be until they were stacked together that the ancient woman would truly come to life. Once the meticulous scanning was completed, it was finally time for the mummy to show herself. A computer compiled the pictures into a 3D rendering, but the quality was poor. In living patients, bone is dense and shows up white. Fat, flesh, and skin are gray. Liquid is black. In Jed's body, the bones had lost minerals and become softer, while the soft tissue had toughened. Instead of a high-contrast image, Jed was showing up only in shades of gray. This low-contrast problem meant that Holoka would have to painstakingly render the images slice by slice. Imaging the skull in a live patient takes 10 minutes. It took Holoka 3 hours to reconstruct Jed's skull and hundreds of hours to render the entire body. Holoka was then able to electronically peel away the layers. After removing the outermost layer of cartilage, she arrived at the linen wrapping that surrounded the head. Gray circles showed up over the eye sockets. The Egyptians inserted plates behind the lids to keep the features from sinking. Holoka also noticed that in keeping with the ritual, Jed's brain had been removed and her skull stuffed with linen. Finally, the image of a small, young woman appeared. Based on the pattern of bone fusion, Jed was estimated to be 30 to 35 years old when she died.
And the first thing I thought when I saw her skull, after doing a lot of 3D imaging on various skulls, is that she must have been a very pretty lady. She had very high cheekbones and she had a very well-defined chin.
Holoka had used CT technology to excavate the mummy. Now, Lewin wanted to know what killed her. Could he determine cause of death 3,000 years after the fact? Lewin examined the 3D image of Jed's skull. He noticed a strange black shape on the left jawbone. The gaping hole, he realized, was an enormous abscess. Hard as it is to believe, Jed had died from dental disease. Ancient Egyptians were prone to dental disease because of their sandy, coarse diet and their love for sweets. In Jed's case, the outer enamel on 24 of her 28 teeth had worn away, exposing the sensitive dental pulp and the root. Exposed roots are acutely painful. They also become infected easily. Jed's infection was spread from the root canal to the bone, where it caused several abscesses. Lewin surmised that the large pus-filled cyst probably burst, spreading infection throughout her body and poisoning her blood. It was probably an agonizingly painful, drawn-out death.
She probably died a very, very miserable death due to genital infection, which originated from this basically dental abscess of her left upper jaw.
In life, this beautiful musician from Thebes endured agonizing pain. In death, thanks to the pioneering efforts of Dr. Lewin's team, she has finally achieved the kind of celebrated and dignified afterlife her culture held so dearly.
With this type of imaging, really, we have pioneered the use of that sort of technology which is non-destructive and which gives us tremendous information in relation to diseases of ancient man.
Because Jeramesank had been so carefully preserved, time didn't stand in the way of science. Detectives who lure truth from the murky past are constantly fighting against the ravages of time. Today, science is their greatest ally in that battle. Armed with the latest techniques, forensics experts are winning the war against time, liberating lost and forgotten voices from beyond the grave.